Introducing Recorded Content, a podcast for small, scrappy B2B marketing teams who want to get the most out of podcasting. In each episode, we capture stories from industry experts and podcasters. Listen in and uncover what it takes to launch, run, and grow a successful B2B podcast. Check out and subscribe to the show on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows. Let's jump in.
Hi, this is Tristan. I'm a co-founder of Motion and your host for this episode of Recorded Content. Recorded Content is brought to you by Motion, a done-for-you podcast agency for small, scrappy B2B tech marketers. Guest interviews are a big part of a branded podcast, and interviews help gather a variety of perspectives to help out your audience. A lot of companies just focus on interviews from people outside of their organization, and they miss out on a major opportunity to highlight the expertise of internal employees. In this episode, we'll learn about John Tyreman. John is the Director of Marketing at Silverback Strategies, a digital performance marketing agency with locations in Virginia and Pennsylvania. And John hosts the Digital Marketing Troop podcast, a show that focuses on the internal experts within Silverback Strategies. And today, we'll learn more about how John approaches the development of the podcast and why it's important to showcase the talents of people within your own organization. All right. First of all, well, John, thanks for joining me on Recorded Content today.
Happy to be here.
All right. Well, I want to get started with a very serious question. I'm interested to get your perspective on why we're struggling so much with the Washington football team defense so far this year.
Well, I actually played football, and I can tell you I played defense, and I have no idea what they're doing schematically on defense. Chase Young lined up at middle linebacker. Landon Collins blowing coverages. Who the hell knows what's going on there?
Well, I don't think we'll be able to solve those problems here today. We're going to talk about some podcasting, but hopefully they'll turn some things around. I think I'm going to the Chiefs game this Sunday. So
God bless you.
If you're going to turn it around, now's the time, right?
Yeah.
All right. Well, cool. Well, John, I wanted to talk about the show that you're running, the Digital Marketing Troop, and that's the podcast that you lead at Silverback Strategies. But that's not actually your first podcast hosting experience. You were a co-host of a podcast at your previous agency, and I noticed when I was doing some research that your title was the Senior Research Manager. So I was curious, like, how that first opportunity came about. As someone leading research at your organization, how did your experience and your role intersect with being a podcast host?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I guess it starts back when I was a kid, and my brother and I would play music together, and we would record music, and we had a little MP3 player, and we would set it up in the basement and capture our audio, and eventually that evolved into free tools like Audacity was a free tool that you could use to record music and stuff. And then, so I had this experience recording audio and editing audio. And, fast forward to my time at Hinge, we were throwing ideas around, and we thought, well, hey, what about a podcast? And there wasn't really a whole lot of objection to it because a podcast was a relatively low investment activity. All you really need to do is invest time into it. If you know how to edit audio, and there was a lot of figuring things out. But essentially, I spent the first 6 years at Hinge researching the common traits of well-known experts, right? And so we understood there are certain traits that these experts have, and what we wanted to do with the Visible Expert podcast was talk to these well-known experts and understand their journey, and then look at it in aggregate and say, what are the common traits? So for example, we interviewed Rand Fishkin, and we found that his Whiteboard Fridays, that's really what the catalyst to where he was able to get to. And it was consistent. He did it every single Friday. His audience knew that it was coming, and he did that on a consistent basis. And so that was his key to getting to where he went. We interviewed other experts like David C. Baker, the two flavors of expertise, generalized and applied, Daniel Burris, the art of simplifying complex topics. So we found these common traits, and it was a fun ride. Yeah, that podcast was great, and I learned a ton.
And you started Digital Marketing True, but based on what I saw, about a year after you went to Silverback Strategies. So what was the spark that led to the podcast that within your new role that you are now?
Yeah, so at Silverback, we're a digital marketing agency, and we specialize in search, social, content, and analytics, which are some pretty technical services, right, for marketers. And we're in the business of selling expertise. And so what we needed to do was, based on everything that I learned about visible experts and selling expertise, you really need to make the expertise of your experts visible, right? And so the first year at Silverback, going through different ways of how can we take our internal subject matter experts, bottle up their expertise and package it in a way that's digestible to our target audience. And what we found was that it's easier to record a 20-minute podcast episode than it is to spend 4 to 5 hours writing a blog post. And so that really was what kind of catapulted us into, hey, let's launch a podcast. Let's interview our internal experts, and then let's put it up there 20 minutes or less every week on a different digital marketing topic. And because it was a low risk investment, we said, hey, why the hell not? And so we just started.
Yeah. And John, how did you present that concept to the leadership at Silverback Strategies?
Well, fortunately for me, I already had some proof of concept. So the Visible Expert podcast, the CEO of Silverback actually listened to that podcast, and he heard a couple interviews with some well-known experts that we did. And so he already had an understanding of how a podcast could fit into a marketing strategy and the benefits of a podcast. So that really made it a little bit easier to pitch to him and say, hey, we should do a podcast. He already knew that I had the skills to do it, that I understood the process, and was comfortable in giving me a shot at it.
So when you do present or pitch to leadership, what did you physically prepare? Was it like a 3 to 4 slide deck thing with a theme of the podcast, or like what were those core components to that initial presentation that you led?
It was mostly a creative brief, just a Word document. And again, like I mentioned, I already had some experience doing it. And when I was hired, I told them that this is a tool that we can use if we want to. So they already had buy-in to it. It was part of a plan. What we wanted to do was really lay the foundation so that we can build up to a podcast. So earlier this year, we went through a big website migration, and so that took a lot of my time. Once we had the website in place, we wanted to make sure that we had a regular routine of getting blog posts up. We wanted to stand up an email program. So there were some kind of foundational pieces that we wanted to put in place, and then the podcast was really a phase 2 item in this plan. So we wanted to get the foundation set. Once we had that, then we were in a position to launch a podcast. And so it was part of the plan from the beginning. And all along the way, leadership had buy-in to it. They understood it. So there wasn't really a big formal presentation deck. Fortunately, I work for a marketing agency, so we understand marketing. So it wasn't a really tough sell.
Right. And before you hit record for the first time, like what are some of the things that you feel are very important to iron out before that first episode gets developed? Like, is it creating a theme or a description for the podcast, or do you feel like it's something a little bit more informal that you can adjust as you go? Like, what are your feelings on that?
Yeah, well, when we first started out, we were testing out a few different concepts. So one of them was and this is one that didn't really work out, but it was like we wanted to have two experts that had opposing viewpoints and wanted it to make it more of a debate style. And that didn't really work out as well. And what happened was we just we had fun with it. We got people together and we just recorded conversations. And naturally it sort of gravitated to talking about a specific topic in the digital marketing world. So if we're talking about SEO, one episode is about keyword research. Another episode may be about Google's core web vitals. Another episode may be about the strategy behind SEO content strategy, or what Google's doing deprecating third-party cookies. So it was all focused on very specific topics that would pique the interest of our target audience. And then it just kind of took off from there. Folks got interested, and then we started recording episodes, and it was a low lift for folks to come on and talk about the things that they already talked to clients about already.
Yeah, and what is the hardest part of that launch process? Was it going through some of those, I guess, experiments, right? Where you found out like this debate format did not work. What were some of those big hurdles that you had before you were actually able to release that first episode?
Well, as anybody who launches a podcast knows, getting reviewed by Apple is the biggest hurdle, right? So that was the biggest hurdle for us, is kind of just the technical side of it, is getting set up on all of those different platforms. Because that review process takes so long, and then there were some technical things like Apple couldn't read our RSS feed, and so we had to troubleshoot all that stuff, and that actually delayed our launch by a couple weeks going through that process. We wanted to launch in the first week of May. It ended up being mid-May because of that. So that was one of the bigger hurdles, and just kind of the headache of dealing with all the technical back-end stuff. And then really getting it off the ground, and then getting internal buzz around it. That's one of the biggest things, because when you launch a podcast, it's great to get that first episode up, but then you got to get people listening to it. And then if you get folks excited about it, then more and more people are likely to say, hey, you know what, I'll be on the podcast. And then it starts to snowball from there.
Yeah, and John, that was something I wanted to get into a little bit. Is how do you create that internal buzz and build some of that momentum internally?
Well, I think it kind of boils down to the way that we distribute the podcast. And it's more than just pushing it out on social or sending an email. One of the biggest tools that we use is Slack internally, and we've got dedicated Slack channel. We call it our engagement channel, where if we push something out on LinkedIn or Twitter, there's folks who are willing to kind of click into it and give it a like, give it a comment, give it a reshare. And what we started doing was we started to create what we call audiograms. And I'm sure that you do this with Motion and your content. An audiogram is simply a video with captions and a wavelength visual, and we take about 1 to 2 minute clips, and we put those videos out on social, and then I'll send a message to the Slack channel and say, hey, we just published this episode. Here's the post on social. Give it a listen. Tell me what you think. And so people saw it. They saw it's a little bit more tangible and digestible on social media. So they saw it. They started seeing the buzz. They started getting excited about it. And then, little things happen. Like we had a couple candidates for some senior level positions that we were hiring for. They said, hey, I listened to the podcast and this is really exciting. And you guys do a good job of explaining topics simply. And, that stuff doesn't show up on an attribution report, but it's incredibly important, right? And then once we started hearing some of that, the CEO was like, hey, this happened with this candidate. He said this. Other people got jazzed about it. So they started seeing the benefits of a podcast outside of downloads or leads generated, right? And then once you start seeing those intangible qualitative benefits, that's really when the momentum starts to build internally.
Yeah, and how do you share some of those like the qualitative feedback? Do you put that in Slack too? Is that something that you share with leadership periodically? Like how do you harness some of that good qualitative feedback and actually give it some visibility?
Well, yeah, you've got to be strategic about the touch points that you have with your leadership team. And what I like to do is package it up into stories as best as I can. Um, so, for example, if someone mentions that they listen to the podcast, I always try to make it a point to bring that up in conversations with the leadership team. So even if it's an internal employee. So for example, I was talking with a colleague of mine and she said, "John, I feel like I know you because I listened to the podcast." And I thought that was really cool because, it's this parasocial relationship that you're building as a podcast host with your audience. And so I brought that up with the leadership team and, just little nuggets about that, just sort of just keeping it front of mind. Hey, there's a lot of benefits outside of the things that we want to measure that are having an impact. And so if you can just package those up into stories and just show that there is an impact, but it's hard to measure, it can go a long way.
Yeah, and I'm curious that the podcast that you co-hosted previously at Hinge relied heavily on experts as guests, and now at Silverback Strategies, you're predominantly relying upon the internal experts. So why did you take that route with this show this time?
Well, it's because of what I learned in the Visible Expert podcast and what I found in that research. Consistency is one of the biggest levers that you have in terms of building a brand, right? So if you're totally reliant on external guests, it's really, really hard to keep to a consistent pulse and a consistent publication schedule. So we wanted to have a weekly podcast, and starting out, that's fairly aggressive, and finding interviews for a weekly show can be hard. And so the having all of the experts internally willing to jump on a Zoom, I've got access to their calendars, so I know when they're in meetings. That's been really instrumental to helping us hit that weekly cadence, that consistency. And over the past couple months, that's the number one reason that we've been able to see the show start to take off, is because we've been able to deliver on a weekly basis.
Yeah, I love that. And we're finding that even with our customers, those that are on that consistent, that weekly schedule, being able to supplement your interviews with external folks with your internal experts really does help because you can kind of fill in those gaps. Maybe if someone pushes an interview off a couple weeks or you have to reschedule something, you can always then plug in like an internal episode to help keep that momentum going. And with that in place, like how did you get to that very first episode? You have your creative brief out there, leadership is bought in, you've even shared the idea of a podcast before you came on board. But tactically, like what did you do to determine that first episode topic, which I believe included two experts that you brought on, and it was about a key topic that you wanted to address, but like where did that idea come from and how did you get the first two people to actually raise their hand and participate?
Well, I commend you for doing your research, Tristan. Thank you so much. The I believe it was gosh, it feels like a lifetime ago when we first launched that, even though it was just a few months ago. But we just what we did is we tried to see, hey, does anyone have an interest in doing this? And at Silverback, one of the core brand principles that we have is being willing to be vulnerable and step out on that ledge and try something even though you're not completely comfortable. And I believe it was Jeff Kurbis who kind of stepped up and was like, "Hey, I'll be on the podcast. I haven't done this before, but let's give it a shot." And so it was that willingness to just kind of set aside imposter syndrome, I guess, and just kind of take that leap of faith. And we recorded something, and we recorded that pilot episode. And actually, what we did was we just took that MP3, and then we put it in Slack and shared it with the rest of the company and said, "Hey, here's a pilot episode. This is what's to come in a couple weeks once we get our distribution platform set up." And actually, I think that what that did is it started that buzz going. It started that momentum rolling. At that point, the podcast went from theory to real because we had something tangible to share with everybody internally. And what that did is it bought us a little bit of time, right? So now we've got momentum going. We've got a couple weeks till our launch date. And then a couple other people said, "Hey, you know what? Now that I see Jeff did it, I'm willing to do it too." And then you get this snowball effect where more and more people see that other people are doing it and they want to kind of join in the fun. And then it just sort of took off from there.
Yeah, I love it. Often you just need that first person who has the courage to say, "Okay, I'll participate." So that's good. And how do you work with your internal folks? Like having you come on recorded content. I shared a high level objective for the episode and where I wanted to take it. But do you take a different approach with the internal people? Is it a little bit more specific, or how do you develop that theme for a specific podcast episode?
Well, it's so funny because it doesn't matter what format, how you create a content. If you're reliant on subject matter experts to create content, whether it's a blog post or whether it's a podcast or whatever, the process is remarkably different based on that expert and their personality, their skill sets. So every one of our guests on the show, they prepare differently for that. Some folks want the questions ahead of time. Some folks are like, "Hey, cool, give me a rough outline and that's okay." Some folks, I'll give them the questions and then they'll go in and they'll write detailed notes, which is great because then it gives me fuel for follow-up questions. So as a host, what I like to do is just be adaptable to the guests and their style, what they prefer, their tendencies, and I try not to, if there's some folks that are really want to know what's coming, I try not to trip them up too much or give them surprises. I'll give them a heads up. Versus there's some folks that are really good on their feet, and they end up giving really great responses if you ask a follow-up question. So it really depends on the guest, and I guess I'm at an advantage because I know these folks and I know their personalities and their tendencies, so I can play into their strengths in that regard. So it's all different depending on your guest.
So since you're working with folks in like a variety of ways, it depends on what their strengths are as a communicator. How do you keep it all organized? Like, what are the major tools that you use to, just facilitate the organization of your podcast episodes?
I mean, it's mostly just Google Docs, really. Like, I'll create a Google Doc for, let's say we have a podcast topic, and let's just say it's on SEO keyword research. That was an episode recently, so it's fresh in my mind. And I'll go in and I'll basically kind of map out the questions that I'm curious about, because I always want to get better at keyword research, because as a marketer, that's always evolving. So I'm curious about what I would want to know. And then I'll pass it to the guest and say, "Hey, here's the questions that I have. Is there anything else that you would want to add to this before we go live?" And they'll come back and they'll say, "No, this looks good," or they'll say, "Actually, why don't we ask this question, because here's something that I really want to talk about." And that collaboration beforehand really helps. But yeah, it's mostly just kind of in a Google Doc and just understanding those relationships. I don't really have a tool that I use per se to keep track of that. Maybe I should, but I don't.
Yeah, I'm just always curious about how people do, like, wrangle internal resources and balance that in the workflow of everything. To keep on track, do you have like project management software, or how do you ensure that you are hitting that weekly deadline that you've put in front of yourself?
Yeah, well, we use Monday.com as our project management tool, and in Monday, you can have an editorial calendar view to where you can look at a calendar, and we've color coded our content to where I think it's like pink is a podcast and blue is a blog post, and so on and so forth. So we know just at a glance, if you're looking at any given month, what days, what types of content is rolling out. And that keeps us organized from a calendar perspective, and then that's a tool that we can use to share with other teams internally so they can understand what's coming down the pipe. So that's been pretty useful in that regard.
All right. And with, you mentioned how internal experts can help really just facilitate that weekly cadence, and it's somewhat easier than managing external interviews. But what is the hardest part about working with internal resources for companies that might be considering that approach?
Yeah, the hardest part is, well, that's a really good question. I find that it's fairly easy to do. I guess the hardest part is if you want a variety of different experts to be on your show. There's some folks who they they're less likely to be on a podcast. Maybe they're more likely to write a blog post. So as a marketer, I need to understand who's willing to be on the podcast, who's willing to write blog posts. But then what I also need to do is I also need to balance and make sure that the podcasts that we're putting out, the same guest isn't coming on every single week. It's important for me, at least, to have variety in the guests that come on, and really kind of making sure that we showcase the diversity of all the experts that we have on staff. And that shows our strength in numbers. So I think the challenge then is getting more and more people involved.
Got it. And with what has been some of your favorite feedback that you've gotten from the folks who have appeared on the podcast? Because I can imagine some of these people haven't been on a podcast episode before, so it may have been their first venture out into that type of format. So what's some of the favorite feedback you've received so far?
Well, I think it's after someone's first time being on the podcast, typically the feedback is, wow, that was fun. That was a lot better than I expected, or that was easier than I expected. And then afterwards, they're more likely to come back on the show. I always love hearing that because that, number one, that tells me that I did my job in making them feel comfortable coming on the show. And then that opens up the possibility of future content. And so if they're more likely to come back on the show, I know that I've got a potential guest down the line so that I could hit that weekly cadence more reliably.
Got it. And John, as you bring on these internal experts and you're building episodes around these core topics, how does this then plug into your overarching marketing strategy? Since you're director of marketing there, how do you connect the dots?
Well, it's easier for our internal experts to come on and record a 20-minute podcast than it is to write a blog post and spend 4 or 5 hours doing that. So the podcast has become the hub in a hub and spoke flywheel approach. So we'll record a podcast episode, and then we'll create a transcript from that. We'll take the podcast episode, we'll push it through our distribution, our syndication platform, so it goes on Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and all of those platforms. But then we'll create a web page in the podcast section on our website where folks can see the episode description, listen to the episode, and see the transcript. And then what we'll do is we'll go through a round of keyword research around each of these topics to say, okay, this is the topic that we talked about. What keywords have the right amount of volume and difficulty and all that stuff so that we can create a blog post from it. So we'll take that podcast episode, we'll spin it off into a blog post, and then we'll embed the podcast episode within that blog post. So if folks find that organically through search, they'll scroll down, they'll see the podcast episode there, so there'll be a touch point there. And then a lot of times these podcast episodes, we'll publish them, and they'll inspire another topic to create content around. The podcast is also fuel for social media. I mentioned the audiograms earlier. So pushing those out through my personal social accounts as the host of the podcast, but also our company accounts too. So the podcast has really become the centerpiece of our marketing strategy and the way that we create content. So that's really how it kind of plugs in at a high level. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I love it. We share a similar philosophy. We have this thing called, and you mentioned a flywheel concept. We actually have a video. I'll send it to you. It's about kind of two wheels. It's like everyone talks about one wheel, but we think it's better to have two. And we talk about how the podcast really essentially fuels your entire main marketing flywheel, and that's exactly what you're doing. We take a similar approach where some of our podcast episodes actually start with keyword research, and we build an audio video episode from that and then back into the written content.
Well, I think it's also important to mention that there's no content creation is very organic. It can be very organic. So it's not like that's the same process that we follow for every single episode. Excuse me. We can do keyword research, and that may inform a podcast topic. We can be talking to clients, and they ask a question, and that can inform a podcast topic. We could be listening on social media to what's generating buzz, and that can inform the content creation. So it's not like content needs to be generated from one source all the time. It's important to keep your ear to the ground and understand where are the right topics coming from. And then that informs the podcast episode. And then keyword research can come down the line. It can inform the podcast. A podcast episode could be generated from a blog post that we wrote. So there's all sorts of different influences.
From your perspective, now that you've hosted 20-25 episodes, and you're leading marketing at Silverback Strategies, like what's been the biggest benefit to you personally as the host of the podcast?
The biggest benefit to me personally, honestly, I'm in a unique position of marketing to other marketers, right? And so to some extent, I fit the profile of our target audience. And so selfishly, these podcast episodes where I interview these subject matter experts, I'm trying to learn about marketing, digital marketing, so that I can be a better marketer. And I think that's the biggest benefit to me is I take away these nuggets about SEO, about paid media, about content strategy, and then I can go and I can implement some of these things. Because these experts, they're helping clients generate leads, generate new revenue. So I know that they've got the skills that if I can just tap into that a little bit, I can then apply it, and then I'm curious enough to learn more about it. If I find value from it, I know that our listeners and other marketers are going to find value from it too.
Yeah, and you mentioned your listeners, which is ultimately the folks you're trying to connect with. Like what's been the best feedback you've heard so far from customers?
Well, funny enough, there's been some interest in coming on to the show from our clients, and I think that that's probably the biggest, uh, you know, the best kind of feedback. Hey, listen to the show. Would love to be a guest on the show. And so now we've gone through and we interview internal experts, and that's how the show got started. But now we're at a point where we can start thinking about how does the show evolve from here. And if we can start having clients come on the show and talk about their experience marketing their products or services, then that opens up a whole new door to guest interviews, hitting that weekly cadence, adding value to other marketers who are listening to the show. So that's been the biggest, best kind of feedback.
Yeah, and John, I was going to ask, like, with the evolution of the show itself, what are some of the big things on the horizon that you're looking to introduce? It sounds like perhaps customers is one of those things, but what else do you have planned there?
Yeah, well, having clients come on the show, that's big, and it's also the podcast is also a great way to repurpose webinar audio. So we did a webinar a week or two ago, and it was in a Q&A format. So I did a moderated Q&A with two different experts, and it sounded a lot like a podcast. And maybe that's just because I'm used to recording all these podcasts. And so that's naturally what the folks that I was interviewing, they're used to hearing from me. So we structured it in that way, and it naturally lends itself to just taking that audio, packaging it up as a podcast. So that's kind of the next step is I know that we want to do more of these webinars. If we can structure them in a way where we can reproduce that audio and push it out through a podcast, the podcast then becomes an avenue for content repackaging, redistribution. So that's one thing. Obviously, getting clients on the podcast, and eventually, maybe we'll end up being in a position where we can have prospects coming on and interviewing them too. So we'll see where it goes from here, but that's what's next on the horizon.
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. I think a lot of people view podcasts, you start with the podcast and then you can repurpose that in a lot of ways. But I think what you're mentioning is you can take some other types of content that you have and actually fold that into your show. So there are a couple of ways to view that. And webinars is a big piece. We're actually doing that with some customers too. And I think that's an interesting angle that people often forget about because it has that natural Q&A flow already. It can really be repurposed in that way. So John, I want to end with a question because a lot of what you're doing so far is around internal experts. If you were to speak with another head of marketing at a B2B organization, like how would you explain the benefits of bringing on internal experts on your show?
Bringing internal experts on is a way where you can hit consistent benchmarks, where you can publish content on a consistent basis. So that to me is the number one benefit. Thinking about B2B tech companies, if it really depends on the industry that you're in, but if you're offering more than just software as a service, if you are offering software and then applied expertise on how to use that software, that's where you can really leverage your internal experts because you're packaging not only your software, but you're packaging it with consulting, with advisory services, some like to call them. So if that's a part of your business model, then what you can do is you can package that expertise and you can distribute it through a podcast. That's one way that you can distribute that expertise.
And John, just to follow up to that, how do you feel about how it helps you as a marketer to work with other areas of your organization?
Oh gosh,
does it break down those silos?
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the biggest things because as a marketer, you really do need to understand all aspects of the business, right? And if you have an excuse, a podcast interview, to interview someone in finance or to interview someone in operations or to interview someone in sales, you start to get a better understanding for the business as a whole. And if you can get a better understanding of the business as a whole, you can market the business better, right? So I think that that's one of the biggest benefits too, is understanding holistically the health of the business. That gives you a better understanding of the brand, so then you can take it to market and market it better.
Awesome. Well, John, I think that's a great spot to end there. Where should people go to learn more about you and digital marketing tree?
Well, I would say that if you're a marketer and you're listening to this right now, I'd say check out Digital Marketing Troop on Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and just listen to one episode. And if you like it, subscribe. If you don't like it, shoot me a note on LinkedIn and tell me what we can do to improve. Because that feedback is invaluable. And if we can iterate on the podcast and make it better, that's what I want to do.
Awesome, John. Well, thanks again for joining me on Recorded Content.
Tristan, thank you so much for having me on. We'll talk soon.